What if honor was no longer a shield? What if the battlefield stopped caring about courage, tradition, or mercy, and survival demanded something darker? On the shores of Tsushima Island in the late 13th century, Japan did not simply confront a foreign invasion. It encountered something far more unsettling, a radically different way of understanding war itself. This enemy did not recognize the rules that had governed Japanese battlefields for generations. There were no formal challenges shouted across open ground. No declarations of name, lineage, or personal honor before steel met steel. There was no patience for ritual, no respect for ancestry, no pause for dignity. Instead, war arrived as a system. The Mongol forces that stepped onto Tsushima fought with a cold, calculated logic. Fear was not a byproduct of battle, it was a deliberate tool. Cruelty was not excess, it was strategy. Every action was designed to break cohesion, shatter morale, and erase identity before bodies even fell. To the samurai, this felt unnatural. Not merely brutal, but wrong, as if the very soul of warfare had been stripped away. This is not the romantic tale of noble warriors charging into destiny beneath fluttering banners. There are no clean duels preserved in poetry, no victories sanctified by tradition. This is the story of collision, the moment when a culture built on honor, ritual, and personal valor met an enemy that valued only efficiency and submission. It is the story of what happens when courage is no longer enough, when belief itself becomes a casualty, when honor stands face to face with annihilation and must decide whether to adapt or disappear. For centuries, Japanese warfare unfolded according to codes as rigid as the steel carried into battle. Conflict was not chaos, it was ceremony. Battles were announced in advance, almost formal in nature, governed by expectation and tradition. Warriors rode forward to declare their names, their lineage, and the deeds of their ancestors, believing that identity itself was a weapon. Individual valor mattered more than formations. A single act of bravery could define a lifetime. Death, when it came, was meant to be clean and earned a final exchange of blades that preserved dignity even in defeat. This system shaped how the samurai understood the world. War was personal. War had rules. And honor was inseparable from combat. The Mongols brought none of this. Their armies were born on the open plains of the Eurasian steppe, shaped by constant movement and endless conquest. They did not fight for personal glory or remembered names. They fought as a mechanism, fluid, disciplined, and relentlessly efficient. Archers advanced and withdrew in synchronized waves, loosing arrows not as individuals but as a single breathing force. Infantry moved behind shields, protecting one another without hesitation. Explosive weapons shattered formations in moments, turning courage into confusion. Commands were not shouted speeches, they were silent signals, flags, and drums that kept the machine moving. To the samurai, this felt inhuman, not because it was savage, but because it was impersonal, as if war itself had been emptied of meaning. But where the samurai saw dishonor, the Mongols saw something else entirely. They saw weakness. They saw opportunity. When Mongol forces landed on Tsushima, there was no pause, no measured advance, no waiting for tradition to catch up with reality. They moved immediately. The samurai rode out as they always had, expecting ritual challenge, a moment where names would be spoken and intentions made clear. Instead, the air itself turned hostile. Arrows fell in disciplined volleys, so thick they dimmed the sky, striking not as isolated shots, but as a single, overwhelming force. These arrows were not meant to grant honorable deaths. They were aimed low at horses, at legs, at movement. Mounted warriors were thrown into the dirt. Lines dissolved into confusion. Control vanished in seconds. Wounded samurai were not acknowledged as fallen warriors. They were ignored or finished quickly, without ceremony, without recognition. This was the first true brutality of Tsushima. Not the bloodshed, but intent. The Mongols were not simply defeating an enemy. They were dismantling an identity. They understood that killing bodies was never enough. Belief had to die first. Break the code, erase the ritual, strip meaning from resistance, and victory would follow naturally. On Tsushima, war was no longer about honor. It was about annihilating the idea that honor could save you at all. Villages on Tsushima were not spared. They were chosen. Mongol forces moved through the island with deliberate intent, turning civilian life into part of the battlefield. Executions were carried out in open view, not hidden in the chaos of war, but staged where they could be seen, remembered, and carried forward in fear. Some were killed. Others were left alive on purpose. Survivors were released to run ahead of the army, carrying stories no messenger could match. Heads were displayed as warnings. Homes were set ablaze, until entire valleys glowed at night. Shrines and sacred spaces were violated, not for necessity, but to send a message. Nothing was beyond reach. This was not random cruelty. It was calculation. Fear travels faster than armies ever could. When samurai defenders finally arrived, they did not find towns preparing for resistance. They found silence. Villages stood empty, doors hanging open, meals left untouched. In other places, bodies lay unburied, left where they fell, a denial of even the final dignity of ritual. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not be met with honor. It would be answered with erasure. For a warrior culture built on the belief that death could still preserve dignity, this was devastating. Not just physically, but psychologically. The battlefield had expanded beyond combat, and fear had become the sharpest weapon of all. In traditional Japanese conflict, non-combatants were not the center of war. They were often spared, displaced, or ransomed, existing outside the ritual space, where warriors tested honor against steel. Even violence followed an unspoken boundary. The Mongols erased that boundary completely. On Tsushima, men, women, and children were cut down together, without distinction or pause. Age offered no protection. Status meant nothing. Entire communities vanished in a single day, not as collateral damage, but as deliberate targets. Those who survived the initial violence were not considered safe. Many were enslaved, forced to serve until exhaustion, then killed to prevent rebellion. Others were executed later, once they were no longer useful. To the Mongols, civilians were not people in the moral sense. They were variables, mouths that could feed enemies, hands that could pass information, voices that could inspire resistance, and variables once identified were removed. Elimination was not cruelty. It was efficiency. For Japanese defenders, this was more shocking than any loss on the battlefield. They could understand defeat in combat. They could accept death in battle. What they could not comprehend was a war that treated human life as expendable infrastructure. A war that did not merely defeat armies, but erased the world those armies were meant to protect. Captured samurai believed that defeat still carried meaning. If taken alive, they expected ransom, exchange, or at the very least, an execution that acknowledged their status as warriors. Even in death, honor was supposed to remain intact. On Tsushima, that belief collapsed. Many captured samurai were bound and displayed, stripped not only of weapons but of dignity. Executions were carried out in groups, sometimes publicly, not to honor victory, but to demonstrate dominance. There were no final words, no recognition of rank or lineage. Others were kept alive longer, forced into labor, made to carry supplies, dig earthworks, or serve until their bodies failed. When exhaustion made them useless, they were killed without hesitation. Their swords were seized. Their armor was taken apart and reused. Their names were never recorded. This, too, was deliberate. The Mongols understood the symbolic power of the samurai class. By breaking them openly, they sent a message that echoed far beyond the battlefield. Even the warrior elite were powerless here. Honor offered no protection. Lineage carried no weight. Reputation meant nothing. Only submission had value. For a culture built on the belief that identity itself was inseparable from the sword, this was annihilation of a deeper kind. Not just the death of men, but the erasure of what made them who they were. The Mongol forces brought with them something the Japanese defenders had never truly imagined. Weapons that did not rely on strength, skill, or proximity. Weapons that shattered the very rhythm of battle. Gunpowder bombs were hurled into tightly packed ranks, detonating with thunderous force. The explosions tore through armor and flesh alike, scattering metal fragments, splintered wood, and bodies in every direction. Horses screamed. Warriors were thrown to the ground before they ever reached striking distance. Smoke swallowed the field. Fire rolled across the earth. The sound alone, deafening, unnatural, broke concentration and dissolved formations. For samurai trained in precision, timing, and courage, this was overwhelming. These weapons could not be challenged. They could not be parried. They did not care how brave a man was. Contemporary accounts describe the bombs as something almost supernatural. Not merely new, but wrong, as if the battlefield itself had turned against those who stood upon it. For the first time, bravery could not close the distance fast enough. Skill could not deflect fire. Honor could not silence thunder. In a single moment, centuries of martial tradition were rendered obsolete. The rules had changed without warning. On Tsushima, war was no longer a contest of men. It had become a collision with technology, sudden, violent, and irreversible. Tsushima was never meant to be held. From the very beginning, the island was expendable. To the Mongol command, Tsushima was not a prize to govern or defend. It was a laboratory, a proving ground where Japanese resistance could be measured, dissected, and understood in real time. They watched how the samurai charged, how they regrouped, how long they held their ground before fear took over. Morale, response, speed, adaptability, everything was observed and then adjusted for. The island was bled deliberately, stripped of its people and resources, not out of rage, but preparation. Every massacre refined their understanding. Every execution tested psychological thresholds. Every act of cruelty revealed how Japan might break under pressure. Nothing was wasted. Tsushima's suffering became information. Its destruction became rehearsal. By the time the Mongols turned their attention toward the mainland, they carried more than weapons and soldiers. They carried knowledge hard-earned, soaked in blood. For the people of Tsushima, the invasion was an ending. For the Mongols, it was data. Those who survived Tsushima carried more than wounds that could be seen. They carried a realization that could not be undone. The old ways were no longer enough. Samurai who escaped the island returned with stories that sounded almost heretical. They spoke of enemies who did not fight like men were supposed to fight. Enemies who did not seek recognition, who did not fear death, who did not respect honor as a binding force. These accounts spread quietly at first, then with growing urgency. What had once defined Japanese warfare now felt dangerously outdated. Tsushima forced reflection, where tradition had once ruled unquestioned. If courage alone could not stop an enemy, then courage had to be supported by something more. Slowly, the transformation began. Fortifications grew stronger and more deliberate. Coastal defenses expanded. Tactics shifted away from individual charges toward coordinated movement and collective strength. Mass infantry formations began to replace the solitary hero on horseback. The island's defeat rewrote assumptions that had stood for generations. Tsushima was not just a loss of land, it was the loss of innocence. From that moment forward, Japan understood a brutal truth. War was no longer governed by honor alone, and survival demanded adaptation. So what, then, was the most brutal act of the Battle of Tsushima? Was it the massacres that erased entire villages in a single day? The executions that stripped warriors of identity and dignity? The calculated terror inflicted on civilians to break resistance before a blade was ever drawn? Or was it something deeper, something less visible, but far more destructive? Perhaps the true brutality of Tsushima was not found in bloodshed alone. It was found in revelation. Tsushima proved that honor, by itself, cannot stop an empire. That courage without adaptation becomes vulnerability. That tradition, when faced with a system willing to abandon morality entirely, can be overwhelmed. The Mongols did not prevail because they were stronger or more numerous. They prevailed because they were willing to cross lines others would not. They turned fear into a weapon, cruelty into method, and human suffering into strategy. And yet, history does not remember Tsushima as a Mongol triumph. It remembers it as a turning point. From suffering came transformation. From brutality came resilience. From defeat came the awareness that survival required change. Tsushima did not end Japan's story. It forced it to evolve, and in doing so, reshaped the future of warfare forever. Empires rise through efficiency. Cultures survive through adaptation. Here at Shadows of Valhalla, we explore the moments where civilizations are tested, where survival demands reinvention, not legend. If this story made you question what truly defines strength, you're already walking the path with us. Stay in the shadows. History hides its truths there.